Checks, and we're welcoming today Brian Lerner, who is an advisor at Checks. Hi, Brian. How are you doing?
Hello there. I'm doing very well indeed. Thank you. Good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you as part of this new session. So, Brian, maybe shall we kick off with a quick intro? Can you tell us a little bit more
Sure, I'd be delighted.
about yourself and you've been doing?
Sure. I retired as Global Head of Energy and Infrastructure Advisory Business at Crédit Agricole CIB a couple of years ago. I spent my entire career in the energy and infrastructure sector. I started off as a project developer in Texas, working on an energy logistics project. I then moved on to the banking side, joining NM Rothschild in London. I worked on the project financing advisory side, but also on M&A transactions in the natural resources sector. I then moved to what was then Chase Manhattan, what was now come JP Morgan Chase. I worked on both the advisory side and the arranging side on debt transactions and also some M&A transactions in the energy and infrastructure sector. Towards the end of my career there, I was very involved in the telecoms side. That was pre-2000. I had a stint at PricewaterhouseCoopers, where I was again on the advisory side on telecoms, on both debt raising and equity capital raising and privatizations. Then in 2005, I moved to Crédit Agricole CIB to head up their energy and infrastructure advisory business. So that's me.
That's amazing. And so the idea here is to kind of like have a chat with you around offshore wind. And, you know, there's a lot of chat right now about energy transitions, about the different projects going on, about as well, how do they access some capital, especially debt, you know, in order to kind of finance this project. And I wanted really to ask you, as a project manager, and you've seen a lot of projects like these, what are for you, you know, the key kind of element and the key drivers to optimize, you know, debt financing for an energy transition project right now in Europe or around the world?
Okay, well, you know, I think offshore wind is probably a very good example of how lenders approach energy transition projects. These projects are huge. A typical project would be 2 to 3 billion euros. And the technology is always evolving. I'll come back to that a little bit more. So lenders have to be pretty imaginative in terms of looking at new technologies. The standard building blocks for any project financing still apply to offshore wind. So it's availability of permits, it's certainty of completion, confidence in the revenue stream, operational capability of the project operator. But they've used some very unique approaches for offshore wind to enable the financing of the projects to go ahead. So the standard approach for completion would be for a creditworthy sponsor to provide a completion guarantee, or for there to be a single point EPC contract fixed price put in place to wrap the entire contract. Now, that just wasn't available at the early days of offshore wind in the early 2000s. The developers were small, so they weren't able to provide a completion guarantee. There was no single EPC contractor which had the expertise to wrap the different packages, the turbines, the platforms, installation, cabling, substations. So lenders actually were very creative and progressive. They accepted 3 to 5 separate contracts, one for the wind turbine supply, foundations, offshore platforms, cabling, onshore works. So a package of 4 or 5 separate contracts, each one fixed price lump sum, but no overall wrap. They combined that with a certain amount of contingency financing, not a huge amount, maybe 10%. They undertook very detailed technical due diligence and obviously a comprehensive insurance package. But overall, this is the only sector I'm aware of where they've broken those fundamental rules of a single EPC contract or a completion guarantee. Another aspect to talk about is the new technology. There has been steady increase in the size of the turbine from if I look back to 2010, standard turbine size was sort of 3 megawatts. If then we look to the last phase of Dogger Bank, which was closed in late 2021 with GE 14 megawatt turbines, each blade of that turbine was 107 meters long. Can you imagine? These are huge, huge animals.
That's huge. That's huge.
It's huge. It was sold to the market. The sort of the previous technology was really 10 megawatt turbines. It was sold to the market as an evolution in technology, but in reality, it was a more like closer to a revolution than an evolution. But lenders got comfortable with it, and they lived with that risk of the scale up. So I think that's very indicative of the sort of approaches that they will take to energy transition projects in general. I think maybe another thing to mention is that lenders are not at all comfortable with electricity price risk. The market is seen as being too difficult to predict. And so they've insisted on fixed prices for electricity. They'll take the risk of whether the project performs to generate the electricity, but not the price of electricity. So governments have stepped in and provided a contract for differences to effectively provide a stable price for electricity, irrespective of the actual market price. And by being very proactive, by governments being very proactive throughout Western Europe and other parts of the world now in providing these CFDs, they've effectively managed to stimulate this huge number of offshore wind projects. Now, that's not to say there are not some projects which have gone ahead without CFDs. There have been Holland, and in Germany there have been some rounds, Denmark as well, there have been some rounds of zero subsidy, so-called zero subsidy projects where there's been no CFD. But the expectation is now the developers have won them, they will put in place corporate PPAs to sell electricity at a fixed price and provide lenders with certainty of revenue generation, which will provide the stability for the financing. So maybe just the other thing to mention is how the sort of the debt parameters have moved over time. So when the industry first started up in the early 2000s, lenders required debt service coverage ratio of 1.35 times. Today it's nearer 1.2 times. Today, they accept a debt equity ratio of 80-20, maybe less than that, actually, maybe 85-15. But that compares with 60-40 required in the early days of offshore wind. Debt maturities, well, they'll finance the construction period plus the period of the contract for differences. So somewhere between the contract for differences may have a 12 or 20-year life, depending on which country it's in. So overall, that could be a 15 or a 22 or 23-year financing, depending on jurisdiction. Pricing, 125, 150 basis points. So I think that offshore wind provides a very, very good template for the way lenders will try to be as creative as they can in terms of, they want to be seen to be supporting energy transition. It's very important for not just their shareholders, but their depositors, their boards want to see them playing a part in this business. They've got to be prudent lenders, but they're willing to devote extra time and due diligence work to get comfortable with new technologies.
And once they want to really kind of ramp up, the execution of a project, and they would want to go for financing, where do they find the funds, especially when it comes to debt financing?
Okay, well, in the early days of this business, the participation of the EIB, the European Investment Bank, and export credit agencies was seen to be very important to give the commercial bank lenders confidence that the project that this new technology would work and has been properly due diligence. So there's great respect for the EIB in this particular field, and some of the ECAs, such as the German and the Danish ones, have a lot of experience because of the turbine manufacturers being located in their countries. Today, EIB and ECAs are still important, but they're important as a source of liquidity for some of the very large financings. The banks don't need them there to lend. But Banks today provide the bulk of the liquidity. There are some 96 banks active in Europe in 2021, mainly European and Japanese banks. CACIB, my alma mater, has been an important player in the market. Institutional investors are definitely there. They can do longer maturities than commercial banks, but they have less flexibility on drawdowns. And because of that, they've mainly been playing in the refinancings post-completion. They prefer fixed rate lending. Structures and approach are quite similar to commercial banks. They're staffed by the project finance teams from commercial banks. Today, pricing is not competitive with banks. That's the way the market is today. I mean, last year before, 2 years before, they were very competitive. So it moves around a bit. Public market bonds, there have been a handful of transactions involved in the public markets. That's a different universe of investors, but terms are not really materially different from commercial banks. And again, the main focus for those have been post-construction refinancings. So there's ample liquidity in the market, huge amounts being raised. Individual projects, I said, for 2 to 3 billion. In 2021, 9.2 billion euros was raised. In 2020, 15.4 billion, with no perceptible upward pressure on margins. I mean, notable Dogger Bank, A and B, which is the largest ever offshore wind financing, which closed in 2020, raised 4.8 billion, and base facilities, now 0.8 billion in ancillary facilities.
Yeah, that's substantial. That's pretty.
That's
substantial.
huge. That's huge, and that was provided by 29 banks and 3 CAs. But ECAs were there for liquidity purposes rather than because they needed to be there to make banks comfortable. So, in a nutshell, it's mainly banks. EIB and ECAs are important. Sometimes institutional investors have an important role to play, but that depends on the particular dynamics of the market at the time.
It's super interesting what you just shared with us, Brian. And I was wondering, when it comes to the, sometimes the financing of new technology can be a bit tricky and can, of course, make people and investors and project managers ask a lot of different questions. How is it really working when it comes to the financing of these new technologies, like, I don't know, floating, offshore winds, or carbon capture or storage, or we've seen also recently the green hydrogens, the batteries, obviously, that have been around for how long? How is it going when you have some kind of like new / cutting edge technologies?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. That's a great question. And maybe floating offshore wind is a good example to talk about. EFGL, which is Les Éoliennes Flottantes du Golfe du Lion, financing, which is the first true project financing for floating offshore wind project. Was signed just a month ago in 2022. Is a project I started off working as financial advisor on before I retired at CACIB. It comprises 3 10 megawatt floating turbines. It's owned by Ocean Winds, which is an Engie and EDPR joint venture, together with the participation of La Banque des Territoires. The floating technology has been tested, but remains in the early stage, and I'll illustrate that. This particular project used something called the wind float technology, which is owned by Principal Power. That was first used in Portugal in 2011 with a single prototype 2 megawatt Vestas turbine. And that operated for 5 years. That was followed by the 25 megawatt wind float Atlantic project, again offshore Portugal, which commenced operations in 2019. So those are the 2 prime prior examples that banks had in front of them. There was a very extensive period of technical due diligence applied to this project. And as I mentioned before, EIB participation was seen as being absolutely vital because of the new technology. EKF, which is the Danish Export Credit Agency, played an important role. CACIB was financial advisor and also was one of the lenders, together with 3 other European and Japanese banks. That project is expected to give banks confidence to finance the 250 megawatt upcoming floating offshore wind projects, which are sort of in the pipeline now. So the fact that that has been successfully financed will give banks the confidence to then scale up again the size of the turbines on the floating offshore wind and deploy it on more commercial scale. So I think that CCS, carbon capture and storage, green hydrogen, batteries, etc., will follow the similar sort of incremental approach. Lends are not about to finance unproven technology, but they will finance early stage technology where pilot projects have already been implemented and the performance of the technology has already been demonstrated.
That's amazing. Well, it's super insightful and really cool chat, Brian. We have a lot of people who also seems to enjoy the have some comments and someone who joined us from Nigeria. Yeah, so really cool to have you today on this session, Brian, and a big thank you again.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed. I enjoyed talking